Welcome everybody, I'm Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. Welcome to this event which is to mark the launch of the new edition of the Routledge Guide to the European Union, initially written by Dick Leonard. Many of you knew Dick, some of you didn't know him, he was a wonderful man. And just a brief anecdote about him before we kick off. We wouldn't be here, none of us would be here today if it wasn't for Dick. I was a journalist in London writing about finance in the late 1980s. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I was going to go to Japan. I went to Japan to suss it out, and the Economist decided to send me to Japan. That was great. Then a guy called Nick Valerie came back to the Economist, who spoke fluent Japanese, which I didn't do. So he bumped me and took the job in Tokyo instead of me. I was very pissed off. And Nicholas Thompson said to me, "Why don't you go to Brussels instead?" And I said, "Boring, no quotas. Don't write about Brussels. It's too boring." But they said, "Well, why don't you go and have a look?" So I went and had a look. And I met Dick Leonard, who had been until recently, at that time, the Brussels correspondent of The Economist. Dick took me to lunch at a wonderful Italian restaurant called Barbanera near the Commission. Persuaded me that the Brussels story was actually interesting, worth writing about. So because of Dick, I decided to go to Brussels. And I became the Brussels correspondent of The Economist. And therefore, I became interested in Europe, and therefore the Centre for European Reform was set up. So we wouldn't be here without Dick. It's wonderful to see Raina here today. Dick's a widow, and also Miriam, his daughter. It's very wonderful to be here with you all. I'm so glad we have Mark here as well today. So anyway, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Ian, who's going to tell us about the new book he's written.
I think I'm going to hand over to Mark.
First, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Charles. It's really wonderful to be here today, and to Ian for the incredible work that you've done on this, and for bringing us all here together. And this is a book which has been part of my life for quite a long time. I still remember as a pre-teen when my dad told me that he was going to write a quote-unquote idiot's guide to the European community, which I found very exciting, and then was very disappointed when it finally came out in 1988 under the much more pedestrian title of Pocket Guide to the European Community. It looked like this at the time. I had to reconsider my initial judgment a couple of years later, because I discovered that the main topic on my geography syllabus for the European Baccalaureate was the European community and its history. And Dad's book was vastly more accessible, briefer, more exciting than any of our school textbooks. And it found itself being passed around my class, photocopied by lots of different people. And I still remember the kind of captivating first line of it, where because Dad wrote that Hitler was the main catalyst of the European community, although none of its leaders would readily accept him as a founding father.
I took that bit out.
So Dad wrote more than 20 books and millions of words worth of articles, but this was the first time that he'd actually written something that had a direct impact on my life at the time, and which I found really interesting and exciting. It was also just after the book came out that I first met Charles, who, as he said, just came out to Brussels, I think in 1989, so a few months after the first edition came out. And Charles became a sort of mentor, a very good friend to me and Miriam, lending us his records, but also had a big impact on my professional life. In fact, I'm very happy to work in this building here a few years ago. So it's really lovely to be back here. I wanted to say a little bit about Dad and his entanglements with Europe, a little bit about what Ian's done with the book, and then to think a little bit about what it means for Britain in Europe at the end of it. And Dad's life was very much defined by his entanglements with Europe. He was evacuated as an 8-year-old boy during the Second World War, which had an enormous impact on his development. And then he hitchhiked around the continent on both sides of the Iron Curtain as a young man. He met my mum in 1960, and they got married in 1963. He became a member of Parliament in 1970, and his term as an MP was very much defined by his advocacy of joining the European community as it then was, and he was one of 69 Labour rebels who voted in favour of joining. And then when the Labour Party sort of went off the rails, he escaped to Brussels as a sort of political refugee, and was very happily ensconced there for several decades. covering the kind of minutiae of the EU and trying to bring it to life for the general public. And I think that's something, that mission's very much kind of crystallized in this book, which has been through lots of different lives and afterlives. And I was looking at the different editions of it, and it's amazing how much the European Union, the European community has changed during this period. We think of Europe as a very placid old continent where not very much happens. But if you look back to this book, you know, you've seen the map of Europe change in a fundamental way. The first edition comes out before the end of the Cold War. You see the European Union go from 12 members as it was there to 15 to 25 to 27 to 28, back to 27 again. New currencies emerging. I mean, it's a story of extraordinary, revolutionary change. And interestingly, you know, the process that Ian's been embarked on is very much one of responding to these kind of revolutionary changes. So the first Routledge version of this book came out in 2016, a few months before the referendum, and was partly designed to help encourage people to vote based on some knowledge and some facts to stay in the European Union. And I think when Dad first asked you to join it, he thought, in fact, you wrote it in the preface that there might be a little bit of readjusting to do based around Brexit, but that was the kind of biggest change. But actually, if you look at the book now, it's incredible the work that Ian has done. And I think, you know, it's one of the best decisions that Dad did was to persuade Ian to join him in trying to bring this book up to date and to tell the story of a very different European Union. Bob Taylor, who's a former colleague of Charles's and Dad's, helped to create the first Routledge guide. But what Ian's done is kind of respond to some really quite revolutionary changes that are maybe even as big as Brexit over the last few years. And I think there's sort of three big seismic changes which have really changed the DNA of the European Union, which have taken place just between the first and the second editions of the book. I think for me, the first is the European war project. So for most of its history, the European Union and European integration has been about the quest for peace. But since 2022, most of the energy for European integration comes from the quest for security and the attempt to try and stop and slow down Vladimir Putin's expansionist illegal war in Ukraine. And that has, I think, really changed the nature of the European project. And obviously that's been accelerated since the second coming of Donald Trump earlier this year, which has led to a fundamental shift in the idea about how the European security order can be secured. The second big development, I think, is a fundamental change in the economic profile of the European Union, which, you know, Rachel Reeves would call the birth of securonomics as a kind of EU goal. But the European economy is currently suffering from sort of double coercion. On the one hand, you have Trump's tariffs, on the other hand, Chinese blackmail on magnets and critical minerals. And what you're seeing is a very different sort of economic project from the liberalizing project that was captured in the first edition of the book, towards one which is much more about de-risking the European economy, diversifying the markets, and deepening the single market. But maybe the biggest change is the third one, which I think is to the domestic politics of most of the countries in the European Union, which has fundamentally changed the nature of the EU. And I think a really interesting barometer for that comes from Europe's most colourful and exciting politician, Emmanuel Macron, who was elected as a sort of poster boy of liberal universalism. And he's reinvented himself with a very different kind of politics, which is about tough border, being against crime, and pushing back against the rise of the Rassemblement National, or the National Front, as a defender of sovereignty. And I think that has really, that pattern of what's happened in France is true of every single country, whether it's, you know, what Merz is trying to do to push back on the AfD in Germany, or what, you know, the moderates are doing in Sweden against the Sweden Democrats. So I think that you have some sort of fundamental changes which all create, I think, both opportunities, but also big dilemmas for the UK in Europe. Because if the EU is becoming a security project, that, you know, I think one of the big successes of Keir Starmer's prime ministership, and you know, not that many of them are recognised publicly, has been the way that he's lent into the security vacuum that was created and tried to create a coalition of the willing. But there are questions about whether it's been too tactical, whether you know, he is doing enough to try and rebuild the European security order and to put himself in a kind of position on that. And there's a great chapter by Ian on this new, particularly foreign and security policy at the back of the book. I think there's also big questions to do with the whole question about the economic project. If the EU is serious about secure economics, is the UK going to show that it's part of the solution to having a resilient mutual economy, or is Britain going to be sort of squeezed between American and Chinese and other attempts to put their national interest first? But I think maybe the biggest change is to do with domestic politics, and I think there is a big gulf between the debate which we have about Europe, which is very much as a sort of liberalising project about open borders and things like that, and so the Europe in the minds of the political class here, and the actual EU that you experience if you spend any time in Paris, Berlin, Rome, or other places, which is much more about defending national sovereignty, about closing borders, and about pushing back against liberalism. And unless you change the story about what kind of Europe we're really dealing with here at home, we'll find ourselves prisoners of the sort of red lines of 2016. Which are still very, very stuck and have got very little to do with the politics which is going on in Brussels and in most of the member states. I think that is a big challenge for British policymaking. But anyway, so I think that those are some of the big questions which Ian grapples with in this book. It's an extraordinary piece of work that he's done, because he's managed, I think, to stay true to the original mission which Dad had, which is to try and make this fun and interesting and accessible and readable, but also serious. And you can see from the way that Ian's done this extraordinary combination that he has between being able to explain in limpid prose, but also having a really deep understanding of what the European Union is, which he has developed not just as a brilliant think tanker and a writer about the European community, but as a practitioner as well in the Foreign Office for many years. So I just want to say big congratulations to you for doing this wonderful piece of work, and I hope that you'll all read it and enjoy it as much as I did.
Hope they'll buy it. That's the main thing.
Buy it, exactly.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's great. Ian, tell us about your new book. And you thought it would be a few months' work when Dick asked you to take it on. It's slightly more than a few months' work, I gather.
One of the most misleading emails I have ever received in my life was the one I got from your dad in November 2017, which said, there would probably not be a vast amount of updating involved, as apart from Brexit, there have been few major developments since June 2016, which was when the previous edition had come out. Yeah, well, first of all, we had the Brexit saga itself. I don't think either of us, and probably certainly not the publisher, thought at the end of 2017 that we would have to wait until 2020 for Brexit itself, and then a further year for the post-Brexit arrangements to settle down. Just as I had said to the publishers, okay, I think we're clear to sort of get on with it now, the pandemic started. And suddenly the EU, first of all, did some extraordinary things in the economic sphere with the issuing of bonds, something which had been anathema, particularly to the Germans, for many, many years. And suddenly the EU was taking on vast amounts of collective debt in a good cause. And secondly, which pushed the EU into the health area, where it had never really done anything, and started doing much more interesting things in terms of the health union. So we had all of that. And then just when the pandemic seemed to be getting into the rearview mirror, we had the start of the war in Ukraine, and as Mark said, that transformed the focus of the EU and made it much more interested in defence and security and defence industrial collaboration than it had ever been. So we finally reached a point last year where it felt as though things were stabilizing would be the wrong term. They were becoming stably unstable to the point where it was possible to finalize the manuscript and send it off to the publishers. I'm very sorry that Dick did not live to see the new edition. I hope you wouldn't be too horrified by what I have done with it. One thing I can say for sure is that the first edition was entitled The Pocket Guide. You will need sizable pockets for this edition. I don't know, did Andrew Taylor make it?
Yes, I'm here.
You are there?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are, right, sorry, I couldn't see you there. Yes, so thank you for your extraordinary patience. I'm sure when you agreed with Dick that I should become a co-author, you had no idea it was going to be 7.5 years before you would get a product out of me, but thank you. And the quality of the publication reflects the work that you and your assistant Sophie Idamalgoda have done on it, so thank you very much for that. I also want to thank the current and the former CER colleagues who helped me with all of the bits of the EU that I had not dealt with professionally. I had been a practitioner in a very narrow field, which was CFSP, but there's a lot more of the EU than that. And I relied very heavily on them. They corrected a lot of my errors, and any errors that are left are entirely my fault. I want to thank Charles and also John Kerr, because I picked up an enormous amount of EU knowledge from both of them over the last 12 years plus that I've been working for the CER. But also they have both contributed, and John Kerr as well as Charles, to improving my drafting. I even occasionally use adjectives these days, which is something that the Foreign Office has more or less stamped out of it. And above all, I want to thank my wife, Catherine, who is sitting at the back, but who proofread the whole thing not once, not twice, but 3 times, and is still married to me even after that. So thank you. So with that, let's get on to the substance. I don't know how you want to do this, Charles, but I think Armida is going to act as a discussant for the book.
We haven't talked about Armida, but Armida is, as you know, is the head of the Europe program at Chatham House. I'm glad to say that come October she'll be a colleague here at the CR. So great to have you with us today on the panel, Armida. This is a pre-accession appearance. Tell us what you create a bit of argument, be a bit rude about it, but find some
Well,
It's not too rude.
I won't be rude. I will have questions. But first, thank you, Charles and Ian, for inviting me to join this discussion. And I think the first thing I really want to say is just to make an observation, which I think also says a lot about the UK's role in the EU when it still was part of the EU, which is that the authors of this book are all British. And I think that actually says quite a lot about the role that the UK played within the EU as a pragmatic partner and member state. As we heard from Mark, there didn't exist an accessible guide to the EU, so we created one. So on behalf of the non-British Europeans in the room, I want to thank you for including me and making me a token member of this discussion panel. But I will say, and having read the book, it really is very accessible. And I think, as many of you will know in the room, EU civil servants will all have a copy of the treaties on their desk, and it is their Bible. Now, for anyone who studies the EU, who is not an EU civil servant, this will become the Bible, because it is so in-depth, so detailed, yet actually legible. And congratulations to you, Ian, really for doing that. Now, you had asked me to look specifically at the tail end of the book, the challenges ahead, which your diagnosis is that there are really 5 key challenges, and you've divided them up, but as we'll come to discuss, they also are cross-cutting and kind of seconding that, it becomes very difficult to separate them out, but we'll have a go, which is, putting it crudely, enlargement, integration, or the ability to function, the rule of law within the EU, migration, immigration, and the EU's role in the world. And as I say, this is, you can't talk about enlargement without talking about the functioning of the EU, without talking about the rule of law, without talking about external relations, particularly since Trump has come back to the White House. But I'll just follow that largely sequentially. And as I said, I have a number of kind of questions for you, or kind of would love to get more thoughts on you from this. So starting with enlargement. Now, the question that's been living rent free in my head is, since 2014, when then President Juncker said there will be no further enlargement during his term specifically, which sent out a very particular signal. And he didn't need to be so explicit about it, yet he was, and we all know what happened since, right? It left candidate countries in the Western Balkans in the waiting room at this point for over 20 years. Nothing happened really since the Thessaloniki Declaration of 2003. It opened the door for Russian, Chinese, and Turkish influence in the Western Balkans in particular. And so the momentum has really died. Now, the thing that I've been wondering about since then is, was this one of the biggest strategic errors to have made in recent history of the EU, I should say?
I mean, I think it was understandable in the context of the time, but yes, it turned out to be a big mistake. I mean, none of us has the benefit of foresight, and you know more than any of us. But I think the Big Bang enlargement had, by and large, been a success. I mean, we can come on to some of the problems, and when you come on to the rule of law, that's certainly one of them. But it had been successful in creating a zone of stability and growing prosperity on the EU's borders. And I think Juncker probably underestimated the value of that. You can see that all of the countries that were in the waiting room had problems of different kinds, some of them more severe than others. And it's easy to kind of focus on those problems and not think, well, if we can transform those countries in the way that we transformed the countries of Central Europe after 2004, then that will be a huge benefit to us. And so I think Juncker did underestimate that he looked at the costs of enlargement, he didn't look at the benefits of enlargement enough.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. We'll come back, as you say, to the functioning piece. But I wanted, in the context of enlargement, come to Ukraine, because you kind of imply but don't take an explicit position on something. You write how Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia seeking, and I quote, seeking explicit EU endorsement of their membership and aspirations, but that the EU continued to find ways not to offer this. And that membership was essentially put aside until the full-scale invasion of 2022, when the EU belatedly realized that leaving countries in a grey zone next to an aggressive Russia was contributing to instability rather than stability in Europe, and that the Union would be in a better position geopolitically if it offered membership to the Eastern democracies that wanted it. Now, you imply, but you don't explicitly take a position. To what extent is the EU partially responsible for where we find ourselves now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Which I know is a very provocative question.
Yeah,
but...
it is. So there's no question that only Russia is responsible for invading Ukraine. But I think it would have been possible for the EU to do more to improve Ukraine's resilience, even before 2014, certainly between 2014 and 2022. We have a former ambassador in Kiev sitting here with us, so he will have his own views on this. But I recall from my time in the Foreign Office in the late 1990s that even at that point, the Ukrainians were coming to us and saying, we want a perspective. We understand it's a long road, but we want you to tell us that at the end of that road, we can join the EU. And we were always very reluctant to do that. And I think, there were a lot of societal problems in Ukraine, particularly, again, rule of law, corruption, kleptocracy, state capture in some ways. But the levers that the EU had and used with the candidate countries in Central Europe, it could have used, I think, in Ukraine, and it didn't, because it didn't quite regard it as being European enough. And I think that's still, to some extent, an issue when you look at the Western Balkans, that it's not quite regarded as European enough for us to be able to use those levers effectively.
Yeah. In terms of the integration piece and the functioning of the EU piece, there's a really interesting discussion in the book on the EU's revenue and spending and how Ukraine's accession could be used as a nudge to reform the the common agricultural policy, although of course Poland and others already oppose this. And you write that any significant cuts to the CAP would require the affected governments to put their national and electoral interests second to the wider interests of Europe's long-term prosperity. Now, I think this is really interesting, and that's kind of always been the slight dilemma and challenge between kind of EU level interest versus sovereign national interest, which should be aligned, but too often are not. And this is something that Mark also touched on and alluded to. And in this context of rising, it's been ongoing right for the past 20 years, but nationalism and populism across the EU, how likely is that to actually happen, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's naive optimism on my part. And I think it is, it is very, very difficult because the people who vote for, Macron or whoever, they're people in France. If they see money flowing somewhere else and it doesn't seem to be benefiting them, it's very hard to persuade them to vote for the guy who is agreeing to that. And I don't quite know how you do overcome that, except by European leaders, when they get together at the European level, telling the same story.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that British ministers have a habit of doing, but actually other European ministers do sometimes as well, is to use an idea of Europe as something over which you have victories. So it's, I went to Brussels, I fought Brussels, I brought home a better deal, we will pay less, we will get more, or whatever. And it's very understandable, and I don't stand for election, I don't have to face the pressures that they do. But again, if I look at the experience of enlargement after 2004, quite a lot of money has been transferred to Central European countries that joined, and it has helped them, but it has also helped the rest of us. If you look at the exports from other EU member states to Poland, say, or the extent of trade within the EU since the enlargement, it has increased quite a lot. So it takes political courage, and I always remember, yes, Minister, and that's a courageous decision, Minister. Oh, do you think so? I understand why it's very hard for leaders to tell that story, but at some point, if you don't, you end up with a sort of beggar thy neighbour set of policies that damages everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves because I want to come back to this at the end, but to me, that's also about being dishonest in the story that we tell about the EU. And the way you describe British politicians doing that, that's exactly upon as what Mark Rutte did in his 14 years as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, right? He would go to Brussels and say, oh, but my constituents and I can't do this. And he'd come back to The Hague and say, oh, but Brussels this and that. And that's how it's functioned. And I think your point on the benefits, I mean, expanding the common market is one of the best arguments for Ukraine's accession, and continues to be that. I think the discussion, which is ongoing, and Sebastiano actually was involved in a report on this as well, but about the tension between reform before enlargement, you know, the treaty revision and all of that. As your book rightly says, there's absolutely zero appetite to have treaty revision at the moment. And I think this points to a contradiction of where we find ourselves in the current time, where because treaty reform is unlikely and impossible at the moment, reforms need to be small and we kind of need to tinker at the edges, because of the politics of it. Yet, given the challenges that we face and the bigger, broader geopolitical picture we find ourselves in, they require much more substantial reform, which is impossible. So I think that's a very difficult contradiction that the EU will need to navigate over the next few years.
Armida and Ian, could you wrap up the conversation in the next 5 minutes, please? I want to bring in people from around the room. So
yes,
come towards an end.
I've been conscious of time.
Sorry, I haven't.
I want to come to the rule of law piece. Actually, should we do that? No, well, because it's all intersecting, and I think through various parts, you talk about the enemies from within, and how the enemies from within are being supported increasingly by potential adversaries from the outside. In some places, clear adversaries like Russia and China. In other cases, countries who are still our allies, but that might change over the next few years. I'm obviously talking about the US. And I think that leads to a very complicated picture, because there is this, as you write, the Trump administration is giving them, populist parties, encouragement in their attacks on the EU. They promote national sovereignty rather than EU solidarity. And so, to my mind, there is this kind of open question about how this will transform the EU in so many different dimensions, because there is the big tech versus consumer protection and free speech element. There is the protection of liberal democracy, which the US is clearly coming out for and no longer promoting liberal elements of democracy. Different views vis-a-vis security, different views vis-a-vis values. And I think those are some of the key challenges, which I guess if we're wrapping up leads us to the future of the EU. And as Mark was saying, the EU is this constantly evolving beast. You know, it's hard to kind of really put a grip to it, but where will it go from here if we're thinking about this integration versus nationalism? And again, it's not the first time the EU has faced challenges. It has always faced challenges, but because of this multifaceted dimension, it feels particularly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU is at a stage where adversaries on the outside have realized that the most effective way to counter it is to divide it. And I mean, your point about Rutte is very interesting, because actually it underlines the problem that with the exception of Macron, there aren't really many strong voices in favor of the EU
We'll go up to that.
within the EU at the moment. And I think Europe really needs some more of those. You know, we need to take the fight to nationalism. Nationalism has been tried in Europe. It wasn't a great success. And the you know, from the coal and steel community right up to now, the EU has been pushing back at that kind of nationalism and saying, you know, we work better as a collective than we do individually. And we're in a difficult time for that. You know, the technology pushes against it. There are external forces which are working against it. And we desperately need some European voices to be raised in defense of the European project.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's call a halt to the conversation for now. We'll come back to all our panelists in a minute. And I've got a lot of people online, a lot of people in the room. I'm sure some of them would like to ask questions. Those online, could you please raise your electronic hand if you'd like to ask a question, or write it into the chat and I'll read it out. And those in the room, just raise your hands. If you'd like to make a comment or a criticism or a disagreement. Yes, okay. Firstly, David Buchan.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to salute this book because there was a profusion of books that started with the single market in 1992, and they all, except for this one, fell by the wayside. I know because I co-wrote one with the person you mentioned who sent you to Brussels. And I remember he said, we don't want to write a guidebook. And we didn't. And guess what? There's only one edition, whereas this has gone on and on and on. And I just wondered, just on this last point about a strong European voice, any prospect of that coming from Germany, which is so important and has been so important in the past?
That's part of that question here from Sebastian Neihard.
Firstly, congratulations also for achieving this book. I hope there will be a French translation because we also need this kind of handy book outlining everything how it deals. One thing I wanted to raise when you speak about enlargement and treaty reform, we know how difficult it is. I don't mean to oppose deepening and enlargement, but how do you deal in the book or in your own thoughts about the value of a more differentiated multi-speed Europe more and more as it goes on? I mean, the obvious case is, of course, the euro, but we've seen also elsewhere, and perhaps in the case of defense, perhaps in the case of migration policies, and that's the more the Europe expands, it may actually get around treaty reform through differentiation.
Yes, the gentleman at the back with glasses. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, my name is François Valentin. I had a question about the kind of road to Damascus moment of parties on the populist right or nationalists and so on regarding the EU compared to where they were only a decade ago. The success of Meloni as well in Italy is providing a kind of roadmap for all these parties for governance while not rocking with the EU vote too much. How do you see that changing the way the EU does its politics in the next decade?
Would our panelists like to answer those 3 points and come back for some more? That's Mark, why don't you go first?
So I've just been in Berlin the last couple of weeks and met a lot of the people in the new government around Merz, and I think one of the wonderful things about Friedrich Merz is that he is a very retro politician, and lots of people think he's kind of stuck in the 1990s, and this has got some downsides because we are in quite a different world, but it has some upsides as well. In that the 90s were pretty good, actually. They were a wonderful time. But I think that some of the upsides is that he's not freighted by a lot of the disappointments of recent years. So when he kind of imagines Europe, he has not suffered all the psychodrama of Brexit. He doesn't know quite how bad the Franco-German relationship could get. He's still got quite a kind of positive attitude towards Italy and to other kinds of countries. And he has a kind of weird, and he's also like quite attuned to what Sebastian was saying about differentiation. Schäuble and Lammers were like important figures in his intellectual development. So, I think he's both coming in with some sort of energy and some ambition, and has an interesting way of blending a focus on, getting the big states to work together effectively. And for him, when he kind of thinks about the leadership of the EU, it's a sort of Weimar plus. So it's France, Germany, the UK, Italy, and Poland. That's his kind of leadership thing. So it's a kind of pre-Brexit idea of what European leadership looks like. But he's also, made his peace with Ursula von der Leyen, and isn't quite, they haven't yet kind of got into the situation where you had such difficult relations with the European Commission that you had during some of the Ampel period. So I think you could potentially see Germany being a really important force, but also he's quite keen not just to invest in his relationship with Macron, my good friend Emmanuel Macron, as he says all the time, but also having this kind of wider, more balanced leadership role. And he's got a very strong sense as somebody who's a really committed Atlanticist of how lost Europe is as a security player, with the definite pulling back of the US, which is only going to accelerate. And I was very surprised when he was in London last week. He gave this interview to the BBC on the Today programme and said stuff about Donald Trump and the transatlantic relationship, which Keir Starmer would never have been able to say with a kind of bluntness, which is very much in sorrow rather than in anger. He is like, there's very few people who are more Atlanticist than him. So I'm quite optimistic about the possible contribution that Germany can make. And obviously, having lifted the debt brake, the kind of self-harm which Germany has been doing to itself in the last period is no longer going to be imposed on the rest of the EU. And anyway, so I think that also links with what Sebastian was saying. And I also think, in terms of the question of how you deal with other parties, I think that Matt, in some ways, is a sort of answer to that as well. He's totally focused on migration and the dangers of migration, and the danger. He sees his kind of historical mission as keeping the AfD out of power and of saving kind of mainstream parties. I don't know like how successful he's going to be. He probably lost about 4% of his possible support with his move after Aschaffenburg, when he kind of took a tougher stance on migration. So some of the things he does might be a bit self-defeating, but he's got a sensibility about the need to kind of rewrite the European story. And I think these populist parties have got a real dilemma. One of the reasons why they've done badly in recent years and had to reinvent their line on Europe was because of the disaster of Brexit. And now they have a similar dilemma in the same way that they were initially strengthened by Brexit and then weakened by it because it was so catastrophic. They have a similar thing with Trump. Initially it creates a sense that these parties could come to power, but the more closely they are associated with Trump, the more they're going to have to deal with explaining what Trump does, and it's not all going to be good.
Armida, any comments on the questions?
Just on the final one, I mean, pretty much all of them, of these populist parties, no longer want to leave the EU because they see very much Orban's successes and have realized that actually you have far more influence and access to funding when you are a member of the EU rather than being outside of it. But I think this is where looking at these countries and these parties through a Ukraine prism is actually somewhat problematic in the medium to long term, where von der Leyen's test is she will work with any party who is pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, and pro-rule of law. That's all very sensible. What this means in practice is if you are pro-Ukraine, like Meloni, who so far has supported Russia, sanctions on Russia, has supported EU action and support for Ukraine, it's fine. But if you then take a closer look at what Meloni is actually doing in Italy domestically, it is the very beginnings of what Orban did 14 years ago in terms of undermining the free press, attacking the judiciary, attacking women's rights and LGBTQ rights. But because we look at it through a Ukraine prism, it's fine and we ignore it and we don't say anything about it. So I think there's real risks in the medium to long term about taking this approach and dictating EU policy through Ukraine, which is understandable in the short term, but it will have consequences.
Ian?
Yeah, so I think this question of reform and differentiation is one of the most interesting and one of the most difficult. And I devote a few paragraphs to the Franco-German study group because I thought that was, one of the most serious efforts to try and deal with the pluses and minuses and how you might actually structure a differentiated union. And in the end, I still feel that it sort of fails because it's quite difficult to persuade countries to accept an implicit second-class citizenship. You can construct a kind of differentiation where countries decide where they belong, but that's not very. I mean, that's sort of where we've ended up with PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation in the defence area, where actually nobody wanted to be a second-class citizen, pretty much. So you end up with almost an idea that originally was you'd have a core group of countries that were very serious about defence, and you end up with 26 out of the 27 having signed up to be part of this. So that doesn't work super well. But then if you exclude countries until they meet some objective standard, getting them to vote to be excluded is quite difficult. I mean, it's worked in the euro for the euro. Maybe you can make it work if there is a genuinely objective process whereby you can cross from out to in, but not if you are in a situation where you're sort of dependent on subjective judgments of other countries, and they can decide that because you're not taking back migrants or you're treating their national minority badly, you're not going to let them into the club. Then I think that's much more problematic. But I do think that the Franco-German study group was the best effort that has been made so far to come up with a differentiated union that might work.
Okay, who'd like to chip in another comment or question? Okay, the lady there.
Hi, Melina from Lexington. I guess the big question at the moment around transatlanticism. Do you think the Epstein files would cause shockwaves in the EU?
Sorry, say again?
Do you think the Epstein files would cause shockwaves in the EU? But actually, just my actual question is around: do you think the European Union would be able to take the leadership role from the EU, from America, and sort of become the lender of last resort or the defender of last resort for the multilateral systems that we sort of live in at the moment?
Gentleman here.
Akash from the Foreign Office. A question about why do you think there's at the moment, especially a lack of charisma within the European Centre, and where do you see sort of the potential for that to evolve in response to the current developments?
Michael Sherman.
I haven't read the book yet, I'm afraid. I'd like to know how much there is in it about China. There's a China-EU summit coming up for a meeting. We know that the Chinese have an EU strategy, and my question is whether the EU has a China strategy.
Good questions. Let me just say, if you haven't read Michael Sheridan's book on Xi Jinping, it's an essential reading. It's short and very readable and very good. Everybody should buy it when they've finished buying Ian's book on.
The Bitcoin is in the post.
Let's go reverse order. Ian, Armida, and then Mark. Quite briefly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to tackle that last one. I mean, I think the answer is the EU has the bones of a China strategy, which is the famous sort of three-legged stool of cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry. It's not a strategy in the sense that a strategy is supposed to unite means and ends. And it's not very clear what the means are, and it's not very clear what the ends are. Does the EU see the end as regime change in China, which would be a kind of US approach to the question? Absolutely not. I mean, I don't think that's on anybody's agenda in Brussels or in European capitals. But then we haven't quite defined what it is that Europe wants. And I think, we don't know very much about what's in the FCDO's China audit. But from what the Foreign Secretary said in Parliament, I think the UK has exactly the same problem. We have an idea of things that would be good to have from a relationship with China, and we have an idea of things that would be good to avoid. But we're not quite sure how we get one and not the other. And I think that's true of the EU as well. And I don't think that the summit this week is going to be particularly enlightening or bring us a great deal further forward. And I think to some extent the Chinese have missed a bit of an opportunity. Just at the moment, with Trump's tariffs and everything else, I think a bit of sort of honey from the Chinese could have gone quite a long way. Wang Yi being quite so categorical that Russia losing in Ukraine would not be in China's interests seems to me to be a bit of a misstep.
Armida.
Just briefly on China, there's a very good piece of discussion around economic security challenges, and particularly as it pertains to China in the book. So recommend that. On the center piece, I mean, this is the key question, right? How do we return to the center, and what hinges on the return to the center? And I think part of the challenge is that across Europe, we see this, where center politicians or center party adopt on a regular basis far-right positions. And we see this in particular on immigration. Germany has done this, but others as well, and also on climate. And so there's this pervasive myth about where losers for the far right come from, and it's disillusioned Labour voters in the UK or Labour voters in the Netherlands. And actually, those voters don't go there, and you tend to lose, centre parties tend to lose voters if they adopt those positions, because they will go for even further progressive parties. So I think they just haven't really grappled with storytelling, the narrative, but also with what is very often perceived as a genuine challenge and a genuine risk, and how to address that. And I think, as we were talking about before, there's a very small window of opportunity to actually make progress on those issues in the eyes of the voters, as these nationalist parties really gain ground very, very quickly. So it has to happen now, essentially. But the answer is not to adopt far-right policy positions.
Mark, you've written a book or two on China yourself.
On China, I think we're in a really interesting moment where the trinity which Ian described as like von der Leyen revised it recently. So she went from cooperation, competition, and strategic rivalry to dominance, dependency, and blackmail as the threat from China. And there is a kind of paradox. On the one hand, I think, you know, people are facing China Shock 2.0, which is very different from the first China Shock. First China Shock was something that affected a very small number of people doing industrial jobs in kind of low grade bits of the economy. And it did have a real impact. There have been some studies which showed that you could even, like, if you look at people who are affected by China Shock 1.0 on the Brexit map, there is a kind of correlation between Leave voting and what they did. But what's happening now is much more fundamental. China is literally conquering a lot of the kind of central parts of the economy of the future, and is sort of fundamentally questioning the economic viability of a lot of key member states, starting with Germany, which is going through a massive psychodrama at the moment around China. And I think the Commission understands that and has kind of updated it, but the politics of shifting from one economic model to another one is a very, very fraught and difficult one. And we see, I think what happens in Germany over the next 2 or 3 years is going to be obviously by far the most important thing that happens.
Sorry, may I just respond to the lender and defender of last resort?
Very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I think the answer is it's really difficult for the EU to do that. It needs to rethink its approach to issuing debt, because without a safe asset, you can't be the lender of last resort. And on defence, I mean, maybe in 10 years' time or something, but we are not in a place where we could immediately replace what the US provides for European, let alone global security.
Okay, last round of questions now. See, the lady at the back.
Benedetta Morali from the London School of Economics. So when I teach my undergrad students EU politics and institutions, I always start the course by saying, I will not make the EU more simple, but we'll find together a method to the madness. And to go back to the book, I was wondering, what is the method to the madness that you identify? Maybe to make it less academic, not necessarily a theoretical lens or an analytical approach, but rather a fil rouge that like binds the book together and is kind of the main lens that you propose to understand the EU right now and how it's evolving.
A question coming online on back to China, which is from Annetta Boer. At the upcoming EU-China summit, do you see any scope for an agreement that would lead to the removal of the EU's duties on Chinese EVs, Beijing's top demand, in exchange for the withdrawal of China's retaliatory measures on EU cognac, pork and dairy, and or pledges on the flow of rare earths? So could there be a dirty deal at the summit or a good deal? I've got a final question of my own, which is one of the biggest changes in the world since the first edition of this book is that we've all become more realist. The EU has ideals and believes in liberal democracy and multilateralism and so on. Robert Cooper, who wrote an essay that Mark published when he ran the Foreign Policy Centre, invented the concept of the postmodern state. The EU was believed in these wonderful things like multilateralism and rule of law. Well, but as Robert wrote in that pamphlet, the big bad world outside the garden is rather, it's a jungle. It's not very nice, and lots of people in the jungle today, which is more realistic than ever. You've got Xi, you've got Putin, you've got Trump, you've got Modi. They all believe. You've got Erdogan. They all believe in uber realism. My question is, can the EU survive in such an age, given that there's been a shift in recent years, an Africa policy, the EU stopped talking about human rights, because if it talks about human rights, then China will take advantage and just move into Africa, even though it's moving in already. In Turkey, you have the leader of the opposition in a Turkish prison, and the EU doesn't complain about it because we need Turkey's help on Russia and Ukraine and migration. So is the only way for the EU to flourish and thrive in a realist world, to be as realist as everybody else, or can we maintain our own principles to some degree, and how far should we go in maintaining our liberal democratic principles? That's my last question. Let's go in here, and then I'll leave it on.
Yeah. So what's the method and the madness? I think it's basically in what I write more or less on the fact it is more or less the last lines, which is that if we operate individually as European states, we are absolutely little fishes at the prey of large sharks. If we work together, then we have some hope of survival. I can't guarantee that everything will turn out well, but I can pretty much guarantee that if we operate as 27, 28 or 30, whatever, separate small states, we will be in one way or another gobbled up. Charles, on your question, I mean, I think a similar sort of answer, but it seems to me that the EU has to operate as a normative power, at least within its own borders. We didn't get onto the rule of law question, but I think you've got to be able to operate internally on the basis of norms that everybody is signed up to. And what you need to be able to do is to show that model works, that your rules-based order works better than the brutal, dog-eat-dog Hobbesian world of Putin or Trump.
Yeah. Armida.
I mean, very much following on from what Ian was saying, I was a little bit cynical of any jungle analogies. It didn't work too well for Joseph Borrell. But I think this question for me, the question is, can you have a commission that proclaims to be geopolitical when it is refusing to be geopolitical internally, and is refusing to use the tools at its disposal internally? And when it comes to engagement with the rest of the world, because that's really kind of almost at the heart of your question, I think there's two elements to that. Yes, we need to be realist, understood. But I also think that supporting and maintaining liberal democracy and rule of order should also be a selling point, and we should find much better and more constructive ways for engaging with those liberal democracies that still exist in other parts of the world, insofar as we can. But at the same time, for those other countries, particularly in our neighborhood, we as the EU need to be much better at listening to what they're actually asking for. And there still continues to be a gap where the EU will talk about development, institution building, those kinds of issues. Whereas what very often they're asking for, what they want is economic growth, job opportunities, and things like that. So there's just a big gap there, and we're not speaking the same language. So that should be the starting point in terms of where do we go from here and building those relationships.
Last word to Mark.
So I think Robert Cooper wrote a subsequent essay where he kind of came up with a brilliant formula for it. He wrote an essay, I think it was called something like in Prospect, I think it was called In Defense of Double Standards. But he basically said that what we need to do is have one set of rules internally where you defend your security by pooling sovereignty, by transcending a lot of the tragic features of nationalism in the 20th century. But when in the jungle, you have to obey the laws of the jungle. So if other countries are behaving in a more kind of realist way, you need to find ways of answering them. But it's very clear that Putin sees compromise as an invitation for aggression. And and he understands the language of power, and you need to find a way of talking to him and of talking to Donald Trump and other people who operate in a different way externally. It's a difficult balancing act, how you can have one set of norms within the walls of the European Union and another way of engaging with the rest of the world. But unless you manage to find a way of doing that, then the danger is that you either import this kind of realism internally and destroy a lot of the big advances that we've made in our own continent over the last few decades, or you end up inviting the sorts of aggression that we've been living through in the last period of time. And I think that shift from looking at the whole of the rest of the world, a bit like how we saw Eastern Europe after 1989, to seeing other countries as having their own ideas and their own aspirations for the future, has been quite a difficult one. When I first started working on EU foreign policy, we would literally produce documents about China, which treated China as if it was Hungary, where we would kind of have scorecards of their behaviour, and we were only really interested in the differences between, because we were so clear that we'd worked out the way that countries should govern themselves, that we weren't really interested in what the Chinese were doing, except insofar as it diverged from the European way of doing things. And then we would say, we'd mark them about how they were doing in different areas. And it's preposterous and absurd. It kind of didn't even necessarily work on Hungary, but the idea you could get it to work on a kind of continental sized power with several times the population of the European Union that doesn't really want that much from us is kind of preposterous. And I think that's basically the shift that we're trying to make. And I think it is very, very important that we basically keep hold of the essence of what we managed to do within the EU, which is quite an extraordinary story. It's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, that's what this book's about. It's an incredible story of transformation and progress. And but at the same time, understand that we can't simply apply what we've managed to do within our own continent to a world where many countries are trying to write their own stories and are kind of sick of Europeans telling them what to do and judging them. And we have to deal with them in a quite different way. Thank you.
Very well. Thanks very much, Phil. Thank you to those online who joined us. I'm sorry you can't join us the rest of us for a glass of wine. Thanks for coming anyway, to those online. In the room, I hope people won't go away. They need to buy the book and then have a glass of wine. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please?